Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. Today, we're doing a book club episode with Daniel Hummel on, and he wrote the book published by Erdman's, this new book here, The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism, How the Evangelical Battle Over the End Times Shaped a Nation. Fascinating book. Peter and I just loved reading it. There is a foreword by a previous guest we've had, Mark Knoll, on. Great foreword. And then a little bit more, on the looking at the back of the book here, an extra kind of a description of it, a riveting history of dispensationalism and its influence on popular culture, politics, and religion. So this is a great historical, objective summary of it, and I think we're going to learn a lot about it. And we have obviously the author as our guest today, Daniel Hummel. So he's going to talk to us about this book. And so if you go to our show notes, there's a link to Erdman's. So click that link, and it'll take you right to this book. Also, speaking of our show notes, I've mistakenly neglected to mention our link to our covenantal network. It's a confessional network podcast. There's a link. Click that. It'll take you to on some of the other episodes I forgot to mention that. So it'll take you to our network of other covenantal and reformed podcasts out podcasts out there. So confessional podcast network. And so there's also a link to find a local reformed church near your area. And then also just more information about Peter and my show, how to contact us. There's Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. So if you're not watching this and you're just listening to our show, you can also watch it. The video is automatically recorded, put it on YouTube. So I'll let Peter further introduce our guest today, Daniel Hummel.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel G. Hummel, who's the director for University Engagement at Upper House, a Christian study center serving the University of Wisconsin-Madison, leads the Upper House's programming for the university community, and hosts the organization's podcast. So he does something fairly similar to what we do. And he also is the author of Covenant Brothers, Evangelicals, Jews, and U.S. Israeli Relations, has written about religion, politics, foreign policy for the Washington Post, Christianity Today, and Religion News Service. His academic research has been published in Religion, American Culture, and Church History. It is a pleasure having you on the show, Dr. Hummel.
It's a pleasure to be here with both of you.
This will be fun. It's something I learned, and we don't generally send our first kind of icebreaker question that the author doesn't know. Something I learned before this. You lived in Santa Ana for a little spell, which is where I live. We want to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and kind of where you found yourself and how you found yourself in Santa Ana and beyond.
Yeah, I have family on my mom's side in particular, but my dad also grew up in Orange County. And I was born in Fullerton, which is close by to Santa Ana.
10 miles north of us, yep.
Yeah, in Orange County. And then I was a missionary kid. So my family lived in Germany for many years. We were part of a small evangelical mission agency called Greater Europe Mission. Got to be in Germany. I was young at the time, but got to be there when the Berlin Wall came down. And the entire sort of East Germany was opened up to missionaries and in a way that it hadn't been during the Cold War period.
Yep.
So, anyway, we were originally sent, we had a major supporter, a church supporter in Orange County. And so when we had our furlough after 4 years, we ended up living in Santa Ana. And that was my sort of first full year in Southern California. That's actually the only time in my life I've lived in Orange County, but all my family's there. So most years I'm in Orange County at least once, if not more times, to visit family. But deep roots in that area going back to a couple generations now.
That's awesome.
Well, connect with us when you're in town next time.
Yeah,
grab a beer or something. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So more into this before kind of we get into the meat of it. You kind of talk about this in the book, but the book's more like a kind of outside perspective, a historian's perspective on dispensational. But how did you get into dispensational? How did this book come about? Where did the research idea come about? And all that good stuff.
I was the family I grew up in basically assumed dispensationalism as the right way to read the Bible and think about theology. My dad is a graduate of Dallas Theological Seminary, which is the major
Yep.
Seminary historically that's taught dispensationalism. So I grew up just in a culture, in a subculture, I guess, of the church that just assumed that was the right way to read the Bible. But it wasn't cultish or anything. It was just
Okay.
that was the way we
Mhm.
thought about it. And
Yeah, we're Christians, therefore we're dispensationalists, therefore that's how
Right.
we read the Bible.
right, and particularly having a high view of the authority of the Bible was seen
Yeah.
as like taking a literal reading of prophecy in particular.
Yeah.
I ended up after being missionaries abroad. We ended up moving to Colorado Springs to for my dad to work in the home office of Greater Europe Mission, which is headquartered in just north of Colorado Springs. So I ended up attending a mega church there as a kid. That was the same mega church as Jerry Jenkins, the co-author of the Left Behind novels. So that was another. So I remember this was in the 90s, so it was the late 90s when the Left Behind novels were coming out.
Oh yeah, they're
And
huge.
I remember,
yeah,
I remember we sort of had like a Jenkins appreciation day in our church one time, and sort of had him come up on stage, and he was interviewed and all that kind of stuff. So that was
then he
I was
got raptured, and you're like, oh my gosh.
well, not yet. But I was really into those novels as a kid. I remember going to, I mean, this is really Colorado Springs heavy, but going to Focus on the Family,
Oh
where
yeah.
there was a signing day for the sixth novel, which I believe was called Assassins or Assassin. And I still have that, a signed copy of Assassin by Jerry Jenkins. I was probably 12 or 13 at the time.
Yeah.
And anyway, so I grew up in that world. I ended up going to public school and a public university. So I was in a very pluralistic setting where I was learning, some stuff from church, but really being exposed to a lot of different types of Christians and non-Christians.
Yeah.
So by the time I went to college, I went to Colorado State University, which is in Fort Collins, Colorado. I probably had a assumed dispensationalist perspective on things still, just from my upbringing. And I definitely was passionate about keeping my faith alive, but I ended up reading, Francis Schaeffer and C.S. Lewis and other things that none of these people are dispensationalists. And so I ended up basically, without knowing it, adopting a lot of assumptions about the Bible that weren't dispensationalists just because of the people I was reading. And it wasn't until I became a graduate student in history that I really could put categories to a lot of this stuff and understand, sort of draw divisions between different traditions and things like that. But I do credit, that upbringing for giving me a very strong appreciation for the Bible, love for the Bible, a desire to be in it every day and to read. Also just a desire to think theologically, even if I don't necessarily still agree with the dispensationalist views on things.
Yeah.
Dispensationalists have a really good reputation for thinking theologically. There's a quote in my book from George Eldon Ladd, who was a major New Testament scholar and critic of dispensationalism in the 20th century, but he admits or credits the dispensational system for producing millions or thousands at least of pastors and missionaries who just had a love of the Word of God. So I take all that with me. But yeah, by the time I was in college, I was really sort of exploring a broader, I guess you could say, evangelical theological world. And that's when I guess I left the dispensationalist fold in a way and ended up landing at a church here in Madison, Wisconsin. That's part of the Evangelical Free Church denomination. So one that has a pretty distinct influence of dispensationalism.
Oh,
in
it's got a
history.
strong influence. Yeah.
But the church I happened to go to was actually pastored for a long time by a Dallas graduate, but it moved into the more sort of Gordon Conwell stream of I don't even know. We don't really talk about eschatology in a very prominent way, but probably like an amillennial type tradition. So that's where I sit now. But I have a lot of family and friends who remain more sort of in the dispensationalist fold.
Cool. Awesome.
Sure. Yeah, not too dissimilar from even my past too. Just growing up thinking, I'm Christian, and therefore, even though I didn't know the term really dispensational, it was like those things that are dispensational are just Christian, and there's no other point of view. That's kind of the waters I grew up as.
Or any other
American.
point of view, they're kind of playing fast and loose, like you talk about in the book, and they're allegorical, where it's just literal. Yeah, there's a lot of kind of assumptions built into the system.
Yeah, that was probably the overriding, but beyond any detail, it was the sense that anything less than a literal interpretation was somehow a slippery slope toward losing your faith, or at least getting very liberal in your theology, and that was definitely something. I mean, I still sometimes fall into that mode, to be honest. So it's something that you sort of grow up in, and it's hard to think out of it. But the other part of your question was about what made me want to sort of study it like this. And part of that is just growing up in it, but and wanting to learn more about it. I'm an intellectual historian by training, so I'm interested in ideas and how ideas change over time, and how they actually become influential in people's lives and how they live their lives. But there was also a more specific, you could say, historiographical or sort of question among historians that I was interested in, and it was. There's been a lot of history written about fundamentalism by people like Mark Knoll and George Marsden and Joel Carpenter and among others. And dispensationalism definitely plays a role in those stories, but it wasn't, to my satisfaction, treated as a dynamic tradition. It was often treated as a static sort of set of
monolithic.
doctrines.
There's only kind of one thing. There's only one way of doing it.
Yeah, and to be frank, we were talking before coming on air about Mark Knoll's Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, and that's a book that I love and really shaped me as a grad student. But dispensationalism crops up in there, and it's entirely as sort of an anti-intellectual stand-in, and that's probably indicative of how a lot of historians have treated it. So I was interested in thinking of it more as an intellectual historian might, which is. No tradition is just static. I mean, that would require that humans aren't involved. Whenever humans get involved, things start changing, and as long as history is changing, the ideas are going to be adapting. And then there was this very particular debate about the development of evangelicalism in the 20th century and what caused the break between fundamentalism and evangelicalism. And this might be of interest to some of your listeners. And there have been these broader categories around sort of engagement with culture or getting out of the sort of separatism of fundamentalism. But there was an article back in the 80s by a guy named Donald Dayton, who is a historian of more Wesleyan evangelicalism. And he said one of the overlooked factors was that almost all of the neo-evangelicals, or the evangelicals in the 40s and 50s, were not dispensationalists. And all of the fundamentalists, or many of the fundamentalists, were. And I found that to be an interesting sort of theological explanation or sort of angle into a major moment in modern American church history that has been overlooked because we were using different categories to talk about that era. So there are some chapters in the book where I sort of slow down a bit and talk about fundamentalism and the development of neo-evangelicalism and Billy Graham and all those characters, Carl F.H. Henry and others, and try to show how a lot of what they were doing differently than the fundamentalists was actually trying to rethink kingdom theology and their sort of and really get more covenantalist in their theology. As opposed to the dispensationalism that was really predominant in the fundamentalist world. So that was a very narrow sort of intellectual question I had that I really wanted to cover in this book as well.
Yeah, I remember reading that in The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And we talked again before recording. I was reared theologically at Biola, and that was not really a tradition. I knew it as a little bit more scholarly, as kind of some more kind of like muscle behind it. But I had never seen, kind of really strong treatment of the system as a whole. But it was cool reading this and seeing the various strands, which I had kind of known about a little bit, but couldn't have put my finger historically. I just knew like the hermeneutical kind of scripture reading principles that they had, less so where did they come from.
Yeah, getting into the meat of this conversation, and obviously this is a mainly a historical kind of observation and objective outlook, and not totally limited to that, but it is a very helpful holistic summary of how the rise of dispensationalism happened historically, where the decline happened. And so it really bears starting the conversation on a historical perspective. There's obviously people involved, multiple actors and institutions that are associated with it. So it's good to have people, as we get this conversation going, introduced to those, and a variety of interpretations that you profile throughout the book as well that are associated with dispensationalism. So we'll begin with just, the major founder of the decidedly American, though he himself was not American, flavor of dispensationalism. During what period did he popularize this? And maybe just a basic general definition of what dispensationalism is.
Right. So the figure is John Nelson Darby, which a lot of people have focused on, and Darby is credited as being the originator of a lot of what we now know as dispensationalism. He's not necessarily making anything up, but he's combining a lot of different strands of previous Protestant thinking into a new tradition, and he is an Anglo-Irish priest in the Anglican Church in Ireland, so the Church of Ireland, who, as a young 20-something, becomes really disenchanted with the Anglican Church. And this was, to me, one of the more fascinating parts of where these ideas come from, is that Darby was not someone that was coming at dispensationalism necessarily from the end times first. So many people in or outside dispensationalism assume it's mostly an eschatology. It's mostly a theory of how the end of the world will happen. But really, it's a full system of theology, and the way Darby really gets a lot of his ideas organized is around ecclesiology, around what is the church and what is the mission of the church. And so he gets really dissatisfied with the Anglican Church because he sees the Anglican Church basically reducing or blunting its missional role in the world, and playing to the British Empire's interests. And this happens particularly in Ireland, where he thinks the Anglican Church is not doing everything it can to try to convert Catholic Irish to Anglicanism. And so he gets, and there's a particular set of sequences of events that lead him to this, but he ends up basically breaking with the Anglican Church over basically calling the Anglican Church too worldly, too involved in the interests of the British Empire. And he develops a new ecclesiology that basically is that the church is entirely otherworldly. It's entirely focused on, it should be, on mission. And any of these state churches all across Europe are apostate, basically, and that they're failing in their mission to spread the gospel as God wants them to. So he ends up founding the Plymouth Brethren movement, which is a pretty radical separatist sect in the Protestant world, and he's introduced to Americans as the leader of the Plymouth Brethren. And what's interesting to me is the eschatology sort of flows from this ecclesiology. We can get into some of that, sort of how those things connect. But Americans tend to be really interested in the eschatology part, and far less so in the ecclesiology part. So the people who pick up his teachings,
I'm very surprised by that statement. Being, I'm joking. I'm not surprised.
Right.
By that
Right. But Darby is very disappointed. He spent 7 years in the U.S. Over the 1860s and 1870s. He's very disappointed that so many Presbyterians and Baptists and Methodists, less so the Methodists, Congregationalists, like his end times teaching, but they don't want to leave their denominations. And in fact, the Brethren don't even believe in clergy, in ordained clergy. And so he's really disappointed that these pastors also won't reject their
being pastors.
Being pastors. So you end up getting a bunch of Presbyterian pastors and Baptist pastors who end up teaching parts of Darby's system or Darby's theology, but they don't actually follow the key thing that Darby wanted, which was to leave and become brethren. So there's a complicated relationship there. And that's one of the things in the historical literature, there is often a glossing over of this story that would lead one to assume, if they didn't do more research, that basically what dispensationalism is just Darby's ideas transmitted to Americans who sort of unthinkingly pick them up and use them. And in fact, if you look at it, there's an Americanization of Darby's ideas that mean they actually look a lot different than what Darby had intended in the first place.
Yeah, that's a good transition to beginnings of American dispensationalism. And I'm kind of jumping back and forth between this. I think it's helpful because a lot of our listeners are probably more obviously familiar with the American dispensationalism that's been more popularized. Because it's, like you said, it has a different focus than modern day modern day dispensationalism versus kind of older American dispensationalism, kind of immediately post Darby, and especially following the split of the 70s and 80s. So you highlight a few leaders, and we're going to kind of focus on the beginning of American dispensationalism around the Civil War. And I found this part fascinating because it's not what you think of modern day dispensationalism. It's very different from kind of, well, maybe historic, not historic, but like late 19th century dispensation. They disengage from culture. Like we don't want to have anything to do with culture. And especially so with racism and segregation, because that was obviously the hot topic during the Civil War. It's like, we don't want to deal with this. Let's just do our own thing. So who are some of the leaders, and what about dispensationalism allured them in a time of cultural turmoil?
Yeah, and I can summarize a few of the key teachings that that were appealing to Americans from Darby. So we've mentioned the sort of otherworldliness of the church.
Yeah.
So that's a key one. But what that does when Darby develops that, it creates a sort of hermeneutic that goes throughout the whole Bible that divides all of the Bible as God dealing with either the people of Israel or the church. And this creates this is sort of the heart of the dispensationalist theology, is that there's a radical distinction, or at least a clear distinction, between Israel and the church. For Darby, it played into this, what I call a dualism between heaven and earth. And so the church is God's heavenly people and Israel is God's earthly people. And if you believe that, then God has certain ways he deals with Israel and certain ways he deals with the church, and he's trying to accomplish sort of different tasks there. And if you believe that, then your eschatology will sort of form around that, to where the distinctive end times teaching that Darby introduced was the any moment secret rapture of the church, which is God sort of pulling the church out of the earth so that he can resume his plans of redemption with the people of Israel. And so this is also where there's a fascination among dispensationalists with the people of Israel, with the state of Israel today, because they see that as a very significant actor in God's plans for the future. So this is part of what is really appealing to Americans in the 1860s and 1870s, when Darby's actually hanging around in the U.S. and has a bunch of popularizers, other brethren who are writing popular tracts. Darby wasn't a very good writer, actually. He wrote a ton, but he was very complicated and
eclectic.
Dense. Yeah, he never redrafted anything, which as someone who redrafts a lot, I just would shake to know if people were just reading my first drafts of everything I was reading. But he had popularizers who were much better at clarifying, but also simplifying. So he was very sophisticated, very nuanced in his thinking. And some of the popularizations weren't so nuanced. But the key for the American reception that I follow are two different paths. One is through ecclesiology and one is through eschatology. And the Civil War was a very dramatic moment in American history. A lot of people thought that this must be playing into some type of end time scenario, that the end of history was near. And I follow particularly, which is a guy named Joseph Seiss, who was a Lutheran of all things. There aren't many Lutheran dispensationalists today.
Yeah, the least likely person you would think would ever turn to this.
Right. But Seiss was very unique, and he was significant because he pastored the largest Lutheran church in the country in Philadelphia during the Civil War. So he was someone who was convinced that the Darbyite, at that time, what was called the Darbyite system of thinking about the end times, was actually making a lot of sense of the world in the 1870s in particular. So he came at this and was looking around for how to interpret these events that were dramatic in North America in biblical terms and prophetic terms. The more interesting person to me is James Brooks, who is in St. Louis. He becomes the mentor to Cyrus Schofield, who does the Schofield Bible and is really a main trajectory for dispensationalism. And Brooks is in St. Louis, which is what we call a border state. So a state during the Civil War that was officially with the North, but had very strong Southern sympathies. Yeah. And so it was very difficult to be a pastor in a border state, because you had congregations. Think about, I don't know how many of your listeners are pastors or go to churches where issues of race and justice and other things are really hot topics right now. Well, imagine there's a civil war happening and those are the topics. There was a desire for a variety of reasons, some I would say more selfish, some more well-minded or high-minded, to find ways to extract the church from those debates and to focus on what someone like James Brooks thought was the real call of the church, which was not to sort of settle Reconstruction or work for justice, but to do missions work and to disciple people.
Yeah.
And so Darby's ecclesiology, which basically says the church's entire role is heavenly. It is not to try to get into politics or to try to sort of support the nation or anything like that. The whole role is heavenly. This was really appealing to Brooks. And so Brooks talks about his own, what he calls a conversion to premillennialism, and he means a Darbyite version, in the late 1860s. And he's doing this as he's trying to navigate these major tension points in the church. And he becomes the major figure in ushering in premillennialism into the American church, but this particular type of premillennialism, which is Darby's type. And so he comes at that from the sort of ecclesiology angle, and that becomes a major defining point of dispensationalists in the late 19th century, is that they tend to be people who are very focused on missions and discipleship, and say that no matter what's going on in the world, no matter what injustice is happening in the world, the role of the church is not to try to fix those things. It is to try to evangelize people, because the end is near, and our calling is to evangelize the world.
Yeah, which sounds so different than modern day dispensationalism, which you profile obviously in the book. We'll get into it. But my guess is that's not where people think dispensationalism. They must assume it's always been this way, always been kind of culture warrior-ish, and let's kind of affect politics. But it comes from a very different perspective.
Yeah, we'll get to that, but I think there is a through line that makes there's a continuity, which is this concern for global missions.
Yeah.
And it's every generations of dispensationalists sort of come at that, like, what's the thing that's going to make global missions or missions in general continue?
Yeah.
And so when we get to the 20th century, there's a different set of politics to that. But in the 19th century, the politics was basically, let's not weigh in on these things. And I think it's sort of I mean, I don't know where everyone comes from on these things, but there's sort of a tragic choice being made by many dispensationalists at the time. And the other big name here is Dwight Moody, the big revivalist of the late 19th century, who basically picks up a lot of these teachings as well. And Moody makes a pretty clear choice that to get global missions off the ground in a way that is going to scale to the globe, he's going to need the help of Southern white Christians. It's just a fact. Dwight Moody's in Chicago. He's got a big network in the North, but he does a ton of revivals in the South in the 1860s and 1870s. And he's really trying to push this reconciliationist message that the Civil War was really bad. We don't really want to adjudicate whose fault it was. We want to sort of lament everyone who died. And we really don't want to deal with the racial issues after the Civil War, because those are going to detract from global missions. And so that's sort of one of the choices that a lot of dispensationalists make in a real way in the U.S. in the 1870s, is they pull out of any type of concern for the emerging Jim Crow segregationist regimes in southern states. They pull out of trying to do sort of integrated church experiments, and say these are going to really just create massive division in the church, and instead we should focus on global missions, and which is a really good. I mean, I support global missions. I was a missionary kid, as we talked about. But there are choices being made to prioritize some things over the other that have ramifications all the way to today.
Absolutely, yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's highlighted in your title. To dive into this part first, the rise of dispensationalism, and it's obviously got some fertile soil in America, and we all know that it's a dominant view in American Christianity, evangelism, to the point where a lot of Americans, like me growing up, sound like a little bit from you guys too, that you just kind of assume that's the default Christian way of thinking, whether you know the term dispensationalism or not. To be an American Christian is got dispensational views, and so it does seem like there is just fertile ground in American soil, and then it makes us ask, what is it about America that has been so inviting and fertile soil for this to grow? So, and it hasn't really caught on globally anywhere else like it has here, especially historically, because like we even said, the most influential person in the beginning, Darby, he wasn't originally even American, and then it really grew a lot here. So, what is it about American evangelicalism? I'm sorry, that provides such rich ground for his theological system, and how did it start shaping theology in America?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question in some ways, is what's unique about sort of American Christianity on this stuff.
Yeah.
There's some more structural explanations. The Americans are very decentralized. I mean, the disattachment of religion really helps this. It allows for ideas to enter the bloodstream of American Christianity in a way that in countries like Britain or any sort of state church, someone like Darby is always on the outside. He's sort of a sect, and then he's not ever in the center.
There's a stronger hierarchical system that you can't really break into.
That's right, and the U.S. is the opposite, right? It's a marketplace. We often use that metaphor, and anyone who can get a following can start sort of building a church. I think there's a lot of historical reasons. We talked about a few of them why the U.S. would be particularly receptive to these teachings in the 1860s, 1870s. It's also important to know from Darby's side, from the Brethren side, they were very interested in the U.S. As a mission field for the Brethren message, and so they paid a lot of attention to all different parts of the globe. The Brethren were early global missions minded people, but they spent a lot of time, and Darby's time in the U.S. is evidence of that. Really thinking about the American church as a ripe opportunity to be receptive to the teachings that they were offering. And there's a tradition of millenarian sects in the U.S. as well. Darby's coming just a couple decades after the Millerites had their 1843, 1844, their great disappointment where they were expecting Jesus to come back. There's sort of a tradition of Americans being apocalyptic, in at least some Americans, with their religion as well. I think also, to get to the second part of your question about how does this start changing American Christianity or the church, Moody is a big part of this. So Dwight Moody is the biggest revivalist in the country, in the world, you could say, because he does a world tour as well, in the late 19th century for about 30 years, from about 1870 to 1900. He dies in 1899. Moody is the biggest name. He's like Billy Graham was for many decades. And so Moody brought with him an entire sort of solar system of people and institutions. And Moody was you could call him, to borrow a term from later on, a leaky dispensationalist. He had certain, particularly around the rapture, he really taught that people should trust in Jesus as soon as possible because the rapture is coming in any moment. And so he liked sort of the utility of some of these teachings. And when Moody said something, a lot of people listened. And so Moody and his people, his lieutenants and sort of the broader Moody movement, helped create basically the backbone of what we could call conservative Protestantism in America for the early 20th century. And really there's three distinct things there. There's the Bible Institute movement, which are these new types of educational institutes that are intended to train missionaries, but ultimately become colleges in the 20th century and become sort of the bedrock of Christian college world. And those start, many of them, assuming dispensationalist categories of theology and this sense that there's urgency to the missions work because of the imminent return of Jesus. There are the Bible conferences, which are maybe less popular now, but were a major source of teaching and gathering for Christians 100 years ago. So one of the famous ones was the Niagara Bible Conference, which met up in Canada for decades. Was really where a lot of the theologians and writers around end times, eschatology, and other things gathered every year to learn from each other. But there were dozens and dozens of Bible conferences around the country, and many of them were started by people who just assumed dispensationalism was the right way to read the Bible. And that's everyone from people we wouldn't even recognize anymore who started Bible institutes and other things, to people like Billy Sunday, who was a major revivalist in the early 20th century, who was not a theologian by any means.
No, he's a baseball player.
He was a baseball player turned revivalist, but basically just invoked things like the rapture as common parlance because that was the tradition he was taught, and he was just going to take it at face value. And then the third thing are the global missions agencies, and those become the engine for thousands of Americans to go around the globe and spread the gospel. And it's interesting, a lot of that spreading of the gospel was dispensationalist in assumptions. And so you see like the Scofield Reference Bible, which is the main sort of annotated Bible that explains the dispensational system, was published in 1909. It's quickly translated into other languages because of the missions urgency. And many of the people that are early converts are dispensationalists, but there's an interesting trend, which I don't get into much in the book, which is by 2 or 3 generations later, they're out of that mode. And there's interesting stories to that, but it does become, a largely American led theology, when there's another version of it, another version of history, I guess, where it could have been much more global. You could have imagined Chinese dispensationalists and Peruvian dispensationalists and everything else. There's a lot of reasons why that doesn't happen. But those three institutions or engines, you could say, the Bible Conference Movement, the Bible Institutes, and the global missions agencies basically become a major part of evangelical culture. And they're all, by the early 20th century, run by people who are really friendly or actual dispensationalists.
Yeah, and in part, we've kind of gotten into this a little bit. Part of that kind of dispensational engine is a way of reading the Bible. We've talked about this a little bit. Kind of, you'll hear, well, the literal interpretation of this verse is it a little like the word that's literally used here, and my guess is that comes somewhat from the dispensational way, the dispensational kind of vocabulary. And there's a sense, and you talk about this. This is kind of towards the middle of your book. The Bible should be read in such a common sense way that you can basically import today's understanding on the ancient understanding on 2,000 years ago, how they wrote, or 3,000 years ago, or in the prophecies. What we mean today is exactly what they meant back then, and that's generally understood. I know there's broadness to this. There's a literal interpretation, and it became synonymous with both dispensational and premillennial theology, and everything else played with the text, was analogies, was allegories, was fast and loose. So how did the way they read their Bible influence their theology? Or maybe asked in a slightly different way, how did dispensationalism provide a lens for reading scripture?
Right. And there's a lot of interesting angles into this. One that I talk about is the rise of not just common sense in sort of a vernacular, but like the common sense philosophy of the Scottish Enlightenment, and how so much of 19th century evangelicalism in America assumes the categories of common sense philosophy. And the basic takeaway is that anyone possesses this faculty of common sense that can lead toward reasoning just within oneself toward the truth of something. And so if you bring that to a very complicated text like the Bible, it can lead one to think that a surface level understanding of the words on the page are the intended meaning of the text. And what's interesting, I get into a little of even the way that the ability to read the Bible is changing in the 19th century. So things like chronologies and indexes of words in the Bible are emerging at this time. And so the common reader, it sort of democratizes things that at one point were only the purview of scholars, concordances and other things like that. Now suddenly anyone can go to the text, look up any word, and sort of link a bunch of proof text together or mentions of a word together, and using their common sense can decide what that means. And this becomes a popular way that dispensationalists or people before that were sort of proto-dispensationalists would move to the text, and they would be using their common sense. But of course, their common sense is informed by teachings they've received growing up and elsewhere of what these words mean, that lead them to think or argue that the dispensationalist theology is just evident in the text, that there's really nothing that they're doing beyond a plain or literal reading of the text. And in particular, I mentioned this distinction between Israel and the church. And so one of the really common ways that dispensationalists talk about this is whenever you see the word Israel in the Bible, it means the Jewish people of God, that sort of the physical seed of Abraham. And that they read that literally. So they don't ever put in some other definition of Israel than that one. Well, if you do that, then you develop a certain way of reading the prophecies in particular that must relate to not to the church or anyone else, but to
Israel
the
specifically.
to
Yeah.
Israel specifically. And so they see and really most other Christian traditions do allegorize those and see the fulfillment of those prophecies not in ancient Israel, but in the church. They see that as not a plain reading, that you're importing meanings into the text, and that they are the ones holding the line on a literal plain reading of the text. And you have to be in that culture to even well, how to say it, to even think that the literal reading is the most authentic reading or the most accurate reading of a text. Like that's an assumption, because you're assuming that the author behind the text intended to convey the literal meaning and not the poetic meaning or the allegorical meaning.
Yeah, and it's also
but
not done across all texts. The kind of literal surface reading across every text, it's a little bit picky and choosy at points.
Yes, that's right. And it's also not literal in the absolute sense of the word literal. So when reading a prophecy about a dragon coming out of the sea with horns, they're not saying there will be a literal, biological dragon coming out of the sea. It's that corresponds to material, sort of physical reality, or
which is an allegory.
Which, that's right. But it's different than a spiritual reading, which would say the dragon represents nothing that we'd ever actually see, or it's sort of something that is much more moralistic or something. But this type of reading the text is the culture that common sense, Scottish common sense assumptions would lead you to. And so this becomes the baseline for dispensationalist theological thinking. And the last thing I'll say about it is, dispensationalists are also people who don't like the term dispensationalism because it puts them in a box of promoting a certain ism, right? A certain sort of theory of how things go. And most dispensationalists want to say they're doing nothing different than early Christians were doing. They're primitivists in that way, which most Protestants want to think we're no different than the early church on these things. But that creates a complicated situation within dispensationalism where, to the outside, everyone else thinks they're doing something really different than what seems to be obvious. But with inside, they're claiming they're doing nothing different. So it creates this sort of interesting tension where they become almost, I talk about, they become unaware of their own tradition because they don't want to call it a tradition, because they want to say they're doing nothing different than the earliest readers of the text. But and that's why many dispensations really stick to literalism as one of the key distinctives of their system. Charles Ryrie, who's a later theologian, is sort of the most famous one of trying to define exactly what dispensationalism's key defining marks are. And two of the three are the Church-Israel distinction and a historical, grammatical, or literal reading of the text. And so these become sort of the two benchmarks for what dispensationalists claim make them distinct.
Awesome. Yeah,
that's very helpful. And before my next question, just some reflection kind of statements, and I want to see if you can help affirm that I'm saying the right thing or not. But I will say, giving credit where credit's due was something, as a covenantal person, and I think we would all three agree on this, that what we do appreciate from the dispensationalists is that they do see a sense of urgency in spreading the gospel around the world. And we're not saying that they're not Christian, and we're, they're fellow brothers and sisters. They have a different view on some things that we could sharply disagree on, but biblically speaking, we're both Christians, and we appreciate that they're going around the world and seeing that sense of urgency to spread the gospel and get God's message in front of people.
And even desire to read scripture, and a lot of scripture is something I think that kind of influence a lot of, like, well done, or kind of a good desire to read a ton of scripture, whether or not we agree with how they defined it or how they interpreted it. It did really push it, like Nick said, push a sense in American evangelicalism.
Yeah, so that's good. I will say too, something that is a super unfortunate false claim many dispensationalists generally will put upon covenantalism. Covenantalists is, based on the fact that as a covenantal people, we see God's looking at his people is the church, which Israel points to, and the dispensationalism view is categorizing two different groups of God's people is the church in one group and Israel in another group. And what happens is when they misunderstand where us covenantal people are coming from. They're falsely claiming that we're becoming anti-Semitic in some of those views, and that's just a very unfortunate claim that I've heard dispensationalists put on covenantalists.
Right.
Do you have any reflection on that?
Yeah, that is a common claim, and it goes the other way as well. So, covenantalists would often call, not usually anymore, but back in the day,
Yeah.
would call dispensationalists Judaizers.
Yep.
You're
Yep.
basically taking the Jewish view on the kingdom, and that the kingdom's going to be
Yeah.
coming
They
through the
kind of
Jewish
just
people.
threw insults at each other for a long time.
Yes, and these become particularly pointed after the Holocaust, and
Yeah.
this entire reexamination in the Christian world of like
Oh,
what
yeah.
part of our theology led to or allowed the
Yep.
production of Nazi anti-Semitism and stuff like that. I would say, I wouldn't make a blanket statement about any group of people on this. So there are definitely examples you can find of people who use covenantalist categories to be anti-Semitic,
Yeah.
to basically make an argument that
you have a little bit of it in Luther and some of his works.
You do have, particularly later works where he's angry
Yeah.
that the Jews aren't listening to him. And so there's definitely the potential for that. There's also a potential in the dispensationalist system to be very anti-Semitic, at least to the perception of Jews, by treating Jews as basically a pawn in a prophecy scenario where most of them die.
Yeah.
That's sort of or they convert, and for many
Yeah.
Jews that's really offensive
Yep.
to say that too. So and then within both traditions, there's obviously the broader traditions are not trying to get at some type of anti-Semitic argument. And so
Right.
I think it really boils down to in some ways how you talk about this stuff and exactly what point you're trying to make. I know many dispensationalists, when they hear covenantalist, just as you were talking about, sort of this idea that the church sort of whatever
Replaces. Yeah.
So yeah, they will often call it replacement theology.
Yep.
Which is
That's
sort
what
of
I heard at Biola all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's sort of a polemical way to talk about it, right? It's
Yeah.
sort of saying where that is one metaphor, replacement, that you can use, but that's not the only way you can describe the sort of continuity between ancient Israel and the church. So I don't want to sort of say that no covenantalists have ever used their theology to be anti-Semitic, but I would say they have, but that's not the that's not the necessary outcome of the theology, and it is also not the necessary outcome of dispensationalism that you're philo-Semitic. You can be in certain ways, and in other ways you can be really anti-Semitic. And I chronicle a couple people who were really, really anti-Semitic, no doubt about it. In fact, they would say they were anti-Semitic. People like William Bell Riley, who was a fundamentalist in the 20th century, who promoted the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a hoax anti-Semitic document. He supported Hitler, at least tangentially, and he was a dispensationalist as well. So there's not necessarily a definitive or determinative approach to the Jewish people, depending on your theology.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, because I wanted to address kind of some unfortunate mischaracterizations of maybe some people that might have a knee-jerk reaction or comments that on both sides that might be kind of unfortunate on that. So that's good. And then, just speaking personal reflection on reading the book was just so helpful. Especially the chapters on the Great Rift and do kind of highlight some of that historical relationship between dispensationalists and the covenantalists. So I wanted to highlight that as well. So going into my question, we talked a little bit up to this point about the hermeneutical use of scripture. And so I wanted to go into something that's just automatically categorized quite a bit with dispensationalism, but it's not limited to the premillennialism views and the eschatology views and the rapture and that kind of stuff. Going back into that. So you do historical work through this, and you do provide views on the rapture, especially so the premillennial rapture theology of new dispensationalism or new premillennialism views. Though dispensationalists might be convinced this is the best way for reading texts of especially 1 Thessalonians and Revelation 20. It had decidedly theological and practical implications. There's a fervor, like we mentioned, for missions being one of them, spreading the sense of urgency, spreading the gospel, which is good. How did dispensationalism premillennial reading of scripture affect the way that they saw missions and the Christian life?
Right. So the rapture is often termed in dispensationalist culture as the blessed hope. That's what
Mhm.
that verse from, I believe it's Titus, is referencing for dispensationalists. And so they're not totally obsessed with it or anything, but the rapture becomes a key part of how dispensationalists understand what at least the horizon of what they're working toward. And missions, as we've talked about, becomes one of the dominating efforts. And so much of the global missions movement through the 20th century at least has roots in dispensational theology. And actually, it's not just missions. I was thinking through, I work at a campus here at UW-Madison, and we work with a lot of the campus ministries, ones that are like Crew and InterVarsity and Navigators. Those three, all of their early founders were dispensationalists as well. At least part of their founding generation was. And so even different types, not just global missions, but sort of reaching young people, was part of that orientation for dispensationalists. They also are as a group, they were a key part of the fundamentalist world. And so they took up the cause in the 1920s and 1910s, 1920s, 1930s in the fundamentalist modernist controversies. And many of them sacrificed, their pulpits and other things to stand for what they believed were the core fundamentals of the faith, which included the inerrancy of the Bible and, the miracles, the resurrection, all the things that the fundamentalists fought for. And so dispensationalists became part of the sort of the backbone of the fundamentalist movement. And it's really hard to get numbers on this stuff, but I don't know if it was 50% of all fundamentalists were dispensationalists or not, but it was a big chunk. And even the leadership, there was a big chunk. And so the broader fundamentalist culture that emerges in the 1920s, 1930s, it's really deeply shaped by dispensationalism. And that includes the founding of places like Dallas Seminary in the 1920s. It includes the more independent fundamentalist worlds, people like J. Frank Norris and others who were pretty bombastic, but also had big followings in their day. And it included some of the core leaders of the fundamentalist movement as well. So dispensationalists sort of emerge as a culture and have an orientation to both church life and society in a really distinctive way, starting in the 1920s and 1930s. And this is when the term itself comes into being. So the term dispensationalism would not have been familiar to Darby or any of the brethren. They didn't see themselves as promoting a system of theology so much as a set of teachings. And the term comes out of 1927 and this non-dispensationalist fundamentalist who is really upset at the failure of fundamentalists, particularly in the anti-evolution campaigns, to really win the cause on that.
Ghost monkey trial, yeah.
So the guy's name is Philip Morrow. He's a covenantalist, or he was a one-time dispensationalist, and then he left that, and he had the fire of an ex convert, I guess you could say. And so he was looking around for who to blame in a real sort of direct way for the failures of the fundamentalist movement, and he ended up identifying and coining dispensationalism to say all those people who have this sort of otherworldly orientation to the church haven't been committed enough to the cause in this world, in the sort of in the school systems, to fight against this anti-Christian, as he called it, anti-Christian ideology of evolution. And so the term itself comes out of this this way that dispensationalists are being set apart from other fundamentalists because of their ecclesiology and because of their eschatology in sort of looking to the rapture as the next thing on the timeline for God. So the last thing I'll say is dispensations are premillennialists, like we were just talking about. So they tend to have a declensionist view of history and of society until Jesus comes back. And so as they're looking around in the 1920s and 30s, they're seeing the modernists win in a lot of these denominational battles. World War II is coming up. World War I just happened. The Great Depression and massive economic turmoil. They're interpreting all of these things as validations of their theology, that this is what was prophesied.
Mhm.
This is what we should expect, and we should be not trying to reverse these things. These things are going to happen. This is what Satan has his time now to do these things. And what we need to place our hope in is that Jesus is coming back.
Mhm.
And that is a different orientation than certainly a postmillennialist would have, and
Mhm.
even many of the more denominationalist fundamentalists, the people that are Presbyterians or Baptists. They tend to be in these categories amillennial,
Mhm.
and they don't necessarily read all those signs of the times as imminent, meaning that Jesus is imminently coming back any moment now. But dispensationalists tend to do that, and so they tend to orient themselves toward politics in a way that means they're less interested in to put it, less interested in long-term solutions because they don't see that there's a really long-term horizon here. And much more concerned always to preserve the autonomy of the church and the ability of the church to spread the gospel. That's sort of their North Star for politics as well. And so, as we talked about in the 1870s, that meant getting out of certain issues that were going to bog down the church. By the time you get to the 20th century, it often means joining politics to protect, as they understand it, the church from secular humanism or other things, or anti-communism. That's a big thing in the mid-20th century, because they see those as threats to the church's ability to conduct missions as well.
Yeah, and real quick, based on that, we've heard the term like newspaper theology, newspaper eschatology, where it kind of sounds like they might be having a newspaper in one hand, the Bible in the other. They're looking at the signs and of the times we're in the newspaper headlines, and then they're also reading the Bible very literal for what it's saying, implying both of them. Is that right?
That's right, and that's more. I mean, yeah, that's a part of the dispensationalist culture. I end up distinguishing between a more scholastic and a more popular culture within dispensationalism. The newspaper eschatology is the pop dispensationalist bread and butter. That's how they get people to buy their books and watch their TV shows and everything else. Is they can claim some type of relevancy, like, let me help decode the latest development in the European Union or something like that, because it fits into this prophecy. There's also a scholastic tradition that is more wary of that kind of stuff, though they do. I mean, this is part of my sort of critique of them. They do dabble in the newspaper stuff when it suits them, particularly at moments of massive geopolitical turmoil. But they tend to want to be much more reserved on claiming anything like what we're seeing today fits into this prophecy exactly. And there's a history of people doing that poorly and badly. Every major war, there is a dispensationalist who's going to say this fits into this scenario. And so there's a sense of like, this is going to make us lose credibility if we do this over and over again. But there's also a sense that the role of dispensationalism isn't just to stoke those fires; it's to actually build up the church. And that's where like places like Dallas Seminary and later Talbot Seminary, that they're more in that mode. They're trying to train pastors to be faithful expositors of the Bible and to hold up biblical inerrancy and other things they think are really important. And less so to just chase after the headlines. But that's definitely a major part of what most people outside the dispensationalist world know about dispensationalism, is that they'll link up, the really infamous one is something like reading locusts in Revelation to mean Apache helicopters or Black Hawk helicopters. And this is interesting because it's like, that's not literal, right? Because and this was something that the scholastic people would say, which is a literal reading of that would be locusts, like that there are literal hordes of locusts coming. But people that were on the more pop dispensationalist side, people like Tim LaHaye and the Left Behind novels and other things, wanted to make that relevance claim very clear. And the most relevant thing you could do is say, modern military technology is prophesied in the Bible. And let me tell you, sort of how, when we learn about this new type of weapon, well, that actually lines up with this particular part of Revelation. But that was seen by the scholastics as really irresponsible usage, but becomes really the dominant way most people understand dispensationalism.
Yeah, that was really helpful for me, because like how they can treat covenantalists as a little monolithic. I think covenantalists can then treat dispensationalists as a little monolithic, because everyone believes the same thing. It's newspaper theology, which, like you just talked about, and I think this is a good way to kind of dig a little bit deeper. And this is a shift, and you talk about in one of your chapters, the rift between scholastic dispensationalism and popular dispensationalism. And my guess is kind of modern evangelicalism is much more familiar with popular dispensationalism than they are with scholastic. So I want to focus a little bit more on the popular side, although we can kind of contrast this and compare it with the scholastic. And particularly so their relationship with the more majority of the 70s, American politics, Republican politics. And who were some of the major players? You've already kind of dove into some of them. And how did this marriage, and just to be frank, between Republican politics and dispensational theology come about?
Right. And yeah, I think it's first just important to understand how popular what I'm calling pop dispensationalism
Incredibly popular. Yeah.
It's unbelievable. It's I mean, this is part of the my guess would be even today, pop dispensationalism forms Christians on a day-to-day basis more than almost any other popular theology.
Yep.
And so the popularization, there's a history of it being popular all the way back in the 19th century, but it really blows up in the 1970s.
Yeah.
The best-selling nonfiction book of that decade was Hal Lindsey's Late Great Planet Earth. Hal Lindsey went to Dallas Seminary, became a Cru, Campus Crusade at that time, ministry worker at UCLA, and then took a lot of, and this is the 60s, this is sort of the heady, Vietnam protests and everything else. And he popularizes, or he makes a really popular version of the end times teachings that turned into the Late Great Planet Earth. It sells 10 million copies in the 70s, becomes the best-selling nonfiction book of that decade. And it sets Lindsey off on a career of just bestseller after bestseller that's basically recycling a lot of the same insights, but updating them every decade for what's changed in the world.
Yeah, current geopolitics.
Yeah, in geopolitics. So in 1970, he's very interested in the Middle East. Of course, there's a big war in 1967 where Israel takes up, conquers a bunch of territory that makes it look like it's fulfilling
Gets them all giddy. Yep.
Right. By 1980, he updates that because the Middle East is a little less important, but much more important is the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the U.S. and Reagan and all that kind of stuff. But this becomes, a major source for evangelical culture. I trace it through the megachurch world, through Christian contemporary music. There's tons of movies and TV shows that draw on the rapture and other things. So that's one whole sort of commercial legacy or consumer legacy. And then the other big legacy is the political legacy. And this has to do with, this is where I try to have a through line, which is by the 70s, there's this growing critique among conservative fundamentalists and evangelicals that there's a secular humanist threat that is going to take over the country and going to make, and this would be the way they would describe it in the 70s, is going to make the U.S. no different than the Soviet Union. They're going to look the same. They're going to oppress Christianity. And there were some major dispensationalist voices that were promoting this. And some of the big figures from that era were dispensationalists. People like Jerry Falwell came out of a dispensationalist tradition. He was an independent Baptist. And then people like Tim LaHaye, who was the co-author of the Left Behind novels. He was trained at Bob Jones University and then Western Seminary and assumed dispensationalism was right. He was friends with Hal Lindsey and other things. And so he developed a sort of, I don't want to take him too seriously because I don't think he took himself too seriously on this, but he developed what he called a pre-tribulation tribulation. So there's a whole system, and he called it that. It's not he also called it the humanist tribulation. But the pre-tribulation tribulation is more helpful to me to understand what he's trying to do with the eschatology. But basically saying before the rapture, there's going to be a time of testing for the church in America. And that time of testing is not it's not destined to go one way or the other. It'll depend on the church's response to whether the church can meet that testing or fail in it. And to me, this really messes with a lot of the dispensationalist ways they think about the world. But for LaHaye and many people around him, this made a lot of sense. And so they rallied around a political platform, part of it being part of the Moral Majority and other organizations, that was really about asserting Christian values and getting Christians in positions of power in the democratic process to stave off the humanist tribulation, to beat the humanists in taking over American culture. And though this is where like culture wars, I mean, this is a term that they would have embraced, which is like, yes, we're fighting for the culture against these anti-Christian forces. This becomes a major source of the Christian right, as we call it, which is a major source of the Republican Party's influence in the 1980s up to today. And so the dispensationalist contribution to that is really in activating a lot of lay dispensationalists to move from that quietism, or that understanding that, well, the church shouldn't be really involved in politics because that's worldly, to saying we need to be involved in politics to protect the church. If we want the church to continue to be, LaHaye would often quote this stat that 85% of all global missions came from Americans because of the affluence of American society and the generosity of American Christians. And so he would often paint a picture of, like, what would it look like if suddenly 85% of global missions work stopped because the American church was outlawed because secular humanists took control and suddenly it was illegal to be a Christian or something like that. So he'd paint these very bleak pictures of the future as a way to illustrate to the dispensationalists in the pew what was at stake if they just didn't vote in the next election. And they ended up deciding, based on a lot of different reasons, not just dispensationalist theology, that the way you should vote is Republican, and that Republicans stood for the right types of values. They were good on anti-communism. They were good on sort of family values and other things. And once that connection was made conceptually, the two groups, the Republican Party and dispensationalists, at least some of them, get really interwoven in like an institutional way as well. And so through the 80s and 90s in particular, there's a very strong dispensationalist leadership in the Christian right. People like Falwell are going to the White House all the time and meeting with the president and all that type of stuff. And that's one of the legacies now of dispensationalism. It gets more complicated than that when you get to the 2020s and the present day. But you really see a shift. One illustration of the shift is Jerry Falwell, who in 1965 made a famous speech against participating in the civil rights movement. And he said, you should never find a pastor marching for civil rights because that is mixing worldly and heavenly values. And just 10 years later,
he's doing the same thing.
And he's basically saying you better be in the pro-life march if you're a pastor, because this is an existential issue. And so he acknowledges that this was a shift, but he doesn't think it's a shift on his side. Like, he's not changing what he believes. He's assessing the situation politically and saying, for the sake of the church, we now need to be involved, whereas before we didn't need to be. That's the charitable reading of what he was doing. There's less charitable readings as well, that his own biases are playing into these things as well.
So you're saying the shift is not so much his belief system as it is kind of the historic tradition within dispensationalism, again, kind of broad brush, was to pull back from politics, not to be involved in these things. If you had a pastor who was involved in politics, maybe don't go to that church. And then he shifts it in 10 years and says, no, actually, let's be involved in politics, but our side of politics. That's the good stuff.
Right. And the way I'm trying to be, I guess charitable to them, but to try to make it seem like they're not just changing their minds overnight, is that in the 60s, if missions is your lodestar, then the answer is to not be involved in politics, because that detracts from energy that could be spent towards missions. In the 70s, the answer is to be involved in politics to protect the mission effort. And so the missions is consistent. I do think, I don't want to go past this without saying, there's a lot of racism underneath this as well that is animating,
unfortunately,
Christians as well. And so someone like Falwell has a pretty checkered past outside of what we've been talking about in relating to African Americans. And he was in Virginia. He was in a one-time Confederate state as well. So there's a lot of racial history here that you can't just wash that away and say, oh, it's all about this theology. But there is a sense that this missions priority is still animating it. And so when Falwell's giving political rallies in the late 70s, early 80s, he's talking about the purpose of America is to be the sender of global missions. Like, he's articulating the purpose of the United States in those terms, which to me is a key that he really does believe that. Like, that's sort of animating why he's getting involved in politics at that time.
Oh, that's helpful.
All right. Yeah, no, this is such a fascinating conversation, just really objective historically. I mean,
as objective as human beings could be.
I some things might seem harsh, but it's just trying to be as true to historical facts as possible, and so we want to also to my last question is really particularly really interesting because the book, even your title says there, it insinuates there's a fall to dispensationalism, obviously the rise and the fall. So I want to focus on the fall part. We obviously know that dispensationalism is still has its influence today.
Yeah,
It
it's
was too big to fall.
People are like, "What are you
It's
talking about, fall? This is still so huge in America."
Right.
Yeah, it's and I think you mentioned it at some point in your book where it is too big to just disappear. What it's really done is evolved or morphed into maybe some other things. And I know it's lost. We know it's lost some scholarly support since the '90s. But how did the fall come about? What is it evolved or morphed into? Because we want
And
to.
are you sure it's falling? Yeah, that was
Are
my big question. Yeah, it's like,
is it
really?
is it just changing, or did it truly fall? And if it did fall, why did it happen, and where is it now, and where do you have an educated guess where it's going to be in the future?
Yeah, well, I mean, fall in two ways, and they're meant to be provocative. If nothing else, it
Yeah.
gets people to pick up the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One is, so we just talked about the sort of popular legacy.
Yeah.
I'm a historian. I'm also a Christian who has certain views on these things. I'm not a fan of the pop dispensationalist legacy.
Neither am I.
I think it.
Yeah,
I
I'll
think
put my cards on the table. I'm not a fan
Okay.
at all.
So in one way, I end the book talking about people who've helped me think through some of this stuff. N.T. Wright, and then Richard Middleton, who's another
Yep.
scholar in this field. I think there's been a fall in the way that pop dispensationalism has formed millions of Christians to think about eschatology and to think about politics and consuming evangelical culture. And so that's one version of the fall is I don't really. By the end, I was trying to evoke. I talk a lot about sort of the legacy in popular culture of dispensationalism in one of the later chapters. I was trying to evoke almost like a judge's feeling of like there is no king here. It's just sort of everyone's running amok and
everyone's got their own interpretation and just kind of bringing it in separate ways.
And in some particular cases, just trying to accumulate wealth and money off of this type of sort of analysis of the geopolitics and stuff like that. So that's one version of the fall. The other is in the academic world, you could say the evangelical academic world. If you rewound to 1960 or 1970, there would be a big question. I don't think you could put bets on any one of a number of traditions for sort of who would win out in the next 50 years in sort of capturing the centrist mainstream evangelical academic imagination. And dispensationalism was definitely in the running.
It was big. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I try to paint the picture that it's not just Dallas Seminary. There's Talbot Seminary and Grace Seminary in Indiana. There are Dallas Seminary at the time was one of the biggest seminaries in the world. There are academic journals. There are presses publishing dispensational scholars.
Schofield Bibles is selling like crazy at these times. Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about it. So the Schofield Bible is the best-selling Bible annotated Bible.
That was my wife's first Bible, was the Schofield Bible when she went to Calvary.
Yeah, there's so many people I run into. It wasn't my first Bible, I don't think. I think I had a Promise Keeper's Bible first. But, but for so many people, the Schofield Bible, which has these annotations that just explain the dispensationalist view of these things, it's revised in 1967 to sort of update it after 50 years. So you wouldn't guess that 50 years from then, that dispensationalism would basically be an extremely marginal conversation in academic evangelicalism. And one way to just trace this is to see that in the three places I just mentioned, Talbot, Dallas, and a place called Grace Seminary, where are they at today? Well, Dallas still teaches dispensationalism. It teaches progressive dispensationalism alongside some classic dispensationalism. Progressive dispensationalism, in my reading, is a major
it's a different animal. Yeah,
ceding of ground to the covenantalist views
absolutely.
on a lot of things.
Yep.
So
it's like its main critique from the dispensational crowd. Like, this is not what we believe.
Right, and I took those critiques pretty seriously. So even though it's called dispensationalism, that really to me is more of a branding thing than like a substantive thing. Talbot Seminary, we were talking about this before being on air. Its new dean is Ed Stetzer, who is not a dispensationalist.
No.
And I think the legacy is mixed there. And then Grace Seminary is still around, but it's very small and it's not nearly as significant as it used to
It's
be.
nothing like what it used to be.
And then places that in 1960 or 70 had dispensationalists on the faculty, at least in part, places like Trinity, Evangelical Divinity School, and even Gordon had a few. Today, that's not even there's no dispensationalists there, and it's entirely out of style to be a dispensationalist. Where you do find dispensationalist faculty anywhere are either in much smaller independent seminaries or Christian colleges, or there are some that are much older, people who are 65 or 70, and you don't see the sort of 35-year-old hotshot dispensationalist theologian. That's just not happening. So I was trying to do a little projection, which is saying I don't think there's going to be a live dispensationalist theological conversation in like 20 years. I just don't know where it's going to be. Of course, things could change, and something totally crazy could happen, but it just doesn't seem like there's the momentum or the institutional structure for that. I've talked to a few dispensationalist scholars since this has come out who have said, hey, we're still here. I do really want to distinguish. A fall does not mean a disappearance. So a fall is relative to a certain earlier point, and that's really what I wanted to get at. But even those dispensational scholars that have reached out to me, they'll say, we're still here, but we're not able to be taken account of because no one will publish our articles and to me it's like, well, that's part of the fall, is that like the publishers won't publish your stuff. I mean, that's it may not feel fair, it may not feel just, but just looking at it from a historian's perspective, that's what happens when a theological system falls out of favor. And I like to also remind dispensationalists that 100 years ago, they did the same things to the postmillennialists. So postmillennialism was the dominant view in the 19th century. And if you look in the early 20th century, that view is in massive decline in the evangelical world.
After World Wars, people are like, I don't think things are getting better. Things are getting worse.
While premillennialism is going up, and the same thing happened where postmillennialists suddenly don't have the same platforms, and they're losing pulpits and other things. And so, from a historian's perspective, this is sort of just the way things develop. But that's the fall that I was trying to track for the academic side, is this sense that there's really not the biggest systematic theology of dispensationalism was produced by the founder of Dallas Seminary, Louis Berry Schaeffer. That was produced in 1948, and there has been nothing to replace it since. And that's, to me, a sign of a troubling tradition as well, is when your classic text is closer to 100 years old than it is to being new. And you just don't, and it was also comparison at the end to sort of the revival of Calvinism that we've seen in the last, and it's like there's a lot more activity there. There's a lot more young people who are sort of flocking. And I'm not making a value judgment necessarily on that, just sort of observing.
There's just more popularity around it.
And another tradition that has a lot of popularity around it is Pentecostalism. And there's a lot of young Pentecostal pastors who are trying to do, new things with theology.
Especially outside the U.S. that are kind of bringing in stuff here too. Yeah, and one of the things about Pentecostalism, which is interesting, which I go into a little, is that early Pentecostalism was deeply shaped by dispensationalism. Just because of the overlapping networks that were there. And one of the things that you've seen in the last couple generations of Pentecostal theologians is their identification of that, and then their attempt to try to get out of that, to try to say, we don't want to have any dispensationalist assumptions behind our theology. And so that's another sign of decline, is when from a dispensationalist perspective, when the other traditions you've influenced are trying to get rid of that influence, that's not a good sign either. It shows that sort of you're no longer the main dictator of these things. I'm going to turn on the light here. I wasn't moving enough, I guess. Anyway, those are some of the things I was trying to capture with the fall metaphor on the academic side. That's it's fascinating. It's post 70s, the rise of popular dispensationalism and the fall of scholastic dispensationalism fell both popular and scholastic, because there was just no scholarly oomph behind it. It was kind of popular imagination, its marriage with politics. The rise of one you can call branch, and sure, there's variation in that branch as well. It took down both, because it kind of married an unholy marriage, and then went from there. But Dr. Hummel, thank you so much for coming on, for writing this book. I'm sure there are some dispensationalists who are not super happy about this book, and there's some people who are super stoked about this book. But it's a fascinating look at the rise of this, especially in American context. We're just so dominated, and still, like we talked about, popularly dominates the church. Maybe not so much scholastically dominates the church anymore. But thank you so much for coming on our show. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, it's been great. You guys have been great conversation partners. So thanks for the attention and the conversation.
Of course.
Thank you.